Hey, welcome to another edition of Strange Planet. Thanks, as always, for sticking me in your ear. On this edition, Egypt's mysterious first female pharaoh, the Crocodile Queen. And we're going to get into that right now with Andrew Collins, who is a popular writer of history, archaeology, and science. He investigates advanced civilizations in prehistory and is the co-discoverer of a massive cave complex beneath the Giza Plateau, now known as Collins Cave. He's the author of several books, including Origins of the Gods and Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods. He regularly appears on radio shows, podcasts, and TV series, including Ancient Aliens, The Unexplained with William Shatner, and Gaia TV's Ancient Civilizations and Deep Space. He joins us from his home in beautiful Essex, England, and the new book is The First Female Pharaoh, Sobekneferu, Goddess of the Seven Stars. Andrew, good to see you again. Welcome.
Hiya. Yes, good to be here.
Why do we know virtually nothing about Egypt's first female pharaoh? You'd think that'd be a pretty big deal. The first pharaoh of the first female pharaoh of the United Kingdom of the Lower and Upper Egypt Kingdom. Why do we know so little about her?
Put simply, her story was suppressed by those that followed her because she lived in a very tumultuous period of Egyptian history. It was at the end of what had been a very successful dynasty, which was the 12th, which basically ended what's known as the Middle Kingdom. Again, pretty successful period of history. And what happened was that her father had reigned for about nearly 5 decades, and he was, the most victorious of all of the kings of that dynasty. And he had 3 siblings that we know, 3 that certainly play a role. There are others that unfortunately would seem to have died quite young, but they were Sobekneferu, her brother Amenemhet IV, and her sister Nefertar. Nefertar would seem to have been from a different mother. But anyway, at the end of her father's name, his name was Amenemhet III. Basically, he was lining up what would appear to have been his eldest daughter. Now, this wasn't Sobekneferu, this was Nefertar, to rule the country. And even by this time, her name was appearing inside a cartouche. Now that means that you rule the country, and this was absolutely unique. Not just because nobody before this time had had that honor, but she was a woman. So quite clearly, Amenemhet III was preparing for a woman to take over the country. But just to sort of back things up, she was going to rule the country with her brother, Amenemhet IV. Now, they would seem to have been half brother and half sister. But then both the elderly king and Nefertar disappear. Basically, they die. And Amenemhet IV takes over, and he rules for about 9 years. And it would seem as if Sobekneferu comes into the fray at this time. Prior to this time, it would seem that her life was destined for something else, something more magical, more spiritual, to do with a temple. I suggest that it was probably a temple to do with the goddess Hathor. And then what happens suddenly is that she takes the throne after her brother, again, mysteriously disappears. His reign ends. Nobody knows exactly what happens to him. And she rules for 4 years. And during this period, a lot of things change in Egypt. Both her father and her brother were very progressive in their views to do with politics and allowing people to enter into their country from, for the most part, Canaan to the north, what is today the Levant. So these were almost exclusively Semitic peoples. And they were allowed to settle, get jobs, to rise to quite high authority in various cases. They were also involved with things like the army, the navy. They would have obviously been servants and things like this, but they were gradually becoming more and more influential in the country. And when her brother took over the country, he extended this this open border policy even further. And what would appear to have happened is that a lot of people started to realize this was not good for the country, and that if we continue to allow this, the country will fall, quite literally. And it would seem, and this is what I suggest, and this is based not just on my ideas, but a number of different Egyptologists who have tried to tackle this difficult period, is that they would that certain factions would seem to have appealed to Sobekneferu, who was probably unofficially ruling with her brother. I mean, there's nothing to say that she was officially ruling with him, but it does seem as if they were quite close during the early stages of his reign. And basically, I think that they came to her and said, look, country's going wrong. If we support you, you know, would you change what's going on? We'll take care of your brother, you know, either directly or indirectly with her help. And, you know, you will then become, you know, the king, female king of Upper and Lower Egypt, the first ever woman. And, you know, we'll be behind you, so to speak. And this is exactly what would appear to have happened. So the open borders policy and the quite progressive politics of her brother and before her father were changed. And she closed the borders. She stopped a lot of trading outside of Egypt. A lot of things stopped at her time simply to try and shelve up everything that was going on. But the problem, and she changed the religion as well, because it was quite clear that throughout the 12th dynasty, the god Sobek, who was the crocodile god, was coming to fore and becoming more important than virtually every other god, in fact, to the point of being a state god. And what she did was to virtually create a monotheistic religion surrounding Sobek, which, of course, her own name, her own personal name, reflected, you know, her own personal interest in the fact that she ruled as a personification or a representation of this particular god. And what she did was, I think, to try and keep control of the country, was to create this huge, great structure, which we know today as the Egyptian labyrinth. This was in the area which is about 60 miles to the southwest of Cairo, at a place called the Fayum Oasis, which has this huge, great, you know, inland sea, which was linked to the Nile by canals. And this had been set up as the new center of Egypt, quite literally the center, the absolute point of coming together of Upper and Lower Egypt. And she commanded the priests of every single one of the districts of Egypt, of which there were 42, to come to the labyrinth every year to pay their respects to Sobek as the living spirit of their own god. In other words, they all had their own separate gods, which were probably very ancient. But she said, no, 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 they're all just the spirit of the crocodile god Sobek, you know, is what motivates them. It's the power behind them, and you have to come here to make offerings to Sobek. So this is what she tried to do. She tried to change a lot. And she also created the next dynasty that would follow her. And it's important to point out that there wasn't just one, but two dynasties would seem to have started during her reign. One was the 13th, which was very nationalistic, you know, was into the sovereignty of Egypt and keeping that. And many of the kings of that reign, of that particular dynasty, called themselves the servants of Sobek, Sobek Hotep. And they started, even after her death, a cult in her name. So they obviously were very loyal to her, whereas a separate dynasty also started off, which would seem to have been loyal to her brother and her brother's memory, called the 14th dynasty, and they were mostly Semitic based. The kings were Semitic based. They were based in the area of the country which was the Delta, which was the main Semitic area where most of the people coming in from Canaan had settled. And basically, after this time, Egypt did fall apart in an age known as the Second Intermediate Period. And these warlords came in, took over the country, who we remember under the name the Hyksos, or the Shepherd Kings, and they trashed the place basically. And they left in power a puppet regime, the 13th, which had its base of operations in the south of the country in Thebes. And they were considered to be quite weak and wouldn't do anything. And they just were allowed to uphold the Egyptian traditions. But what happened was that they kept alive the sort of the baton of sovereignty of Egypt, which they eventually passed on to their successors, which was the 17th dynasty. I know it's a little confusing. And they would eventually rise up against the Hyksos and throw them out of Egypt. And thus began the new kingdom of Egypt, beginning with the 18th dynasty, which was the great triumph of ancient Egyptian civilization. And from that we have all the great kings, like Moses, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Hatshepsut, who was female pharaoh. We'll come on to her. And everything went back to normal, so to speak. But without her reign, and without what she did, and without the death of her brother, I think that Egypt would have fallen and at best become another vassal state of Canaan, which at that time was incredibly powerful and prosperous. And although it was, still under the influence of Egypt, it was something that quite clearly, without the influence of Egypt, would have grown even more powerful.
Sobekneferu, there's we were talking about how so little is known of her. There is, I think, a statue of her in the Louvre in Paris, but it's only her torso.
Yeah.
And it's kind of unique in that most female pharaohs, I suppose, aside from Cleopatra, were portrayed as very masculine.
Yeah.
And yet Sobekneferu kind of embraced her femininity. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, she embraced both femininity and a male persona as well. And this was it. It's because if she was, as we suspect, the first proper king both of Upper and Lower Egypt, then how she ruled would have been something that most people wouldn't really have understood. In other words, they wouldn't have known whether to address her as a man, a woman, how her statues were to be shown, whether her inscriptions could be, with male emphasis or female emphasis. And so you've got a mixture of both. Her statues seem to be a mixture of femininity and male, and her inscriptions seem to swap back and forth between being addressed as a male and addressed as a female. And what's interesting is that essentially this was exactly what happened again with the female pharaoh Hatshepsut in the 18th dynasty, who, by the way, would seem to have modelled her entire reign on Sobekneferu. There's no question that Hatshepsut, saw Sobekneferu as some kind of spiritual mentor. I mean, obviously, her memory or her presence or whatever it was, and copied her statuary and also copied inscriptions that were found on her sarcophagus as well, which is a very, very interesting story in its own right. But basically, the ancient Egyptians found it difficult to understand how they should address a woman in charge of the country. But quite clearly, these pioneering women achieved this. And paved the way, obviously, for much later, female rulers, including, of course, Nefertiti, who would seem to have ruled for a couple of years after the death of her husband Akhenaten. He obviously created this massive monotheistic religion, which eventually failed. And then, obviously, the Ptolemies, of which the most famous female ruler was, of course, Cleopatra VII. So they were trailblazing. They were pioneers for women, and I mean, they clearly were controlling huge areas of the ancient world. And the fact that all of this seems to start with Sobekneferu, I think, is something that should be celebrated from the point of view of women, and because it started with her. I mean, some people might say, well, hold on, I've heard that there was a few female rulers before Sobekneferu. Well, there were, but they were only ruling because their husbands were away in wars, or that, you know, the husband had died and they were regents or something like this. Sobekneferu was the first one to actually wear the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, you know, the two parts of Egypt, the southern part, the northern part, united together. And the problem for her is that all of her good deeds were completely shunned by later, you know, pharaohs and the Egyptians as a whole, because for some reason, after the end of the Second Intermediate Period, her name seems to disappear. I mean, she's mentioned on some king lists, so, you know, she's not entirely expunged from records, but others completely miss her. You know, her name is not there. I mean, for instance, if you go to Abydos in southern Egypt, there is a relief on the wall showing the pharaoh Seti I, showing his son Ramesses, who is the future Ramesses II. He's sort of like raising his arm and showing all the kings that have ruled Egypt up to this point. And, you know, you have all these cartouches, and they come to and include Sobekneferu's brother, Amenemhet IV. Then there's no pharaoh at all until the beginning of the 18th dynasty, the beginning of the New Kingdom. They're all missing. Right. Now, I understand why most of the ones from the Second Intermediate Period are missing, because most of them ruled just for a few weeks, few days, couple of months, you know, a couple of years, whatever it was, and could easily be forgotten about, you know. And obviously there's a whole confusing array of dynasties in this period. But why should she be missing? There's no reason why she should have been missing, unless they blamed her for the onset of this dark age of Egyptian history, which I think is exactly what happened. And also, the thing is that when she died, it would seem as if there were two pyramids prepared originally for her and her brother, and that these are at a place called Mesguna, which is just to the south of the pyramids of Dashur. Now, that's the bent pyramid and the red pyramid, and also the black pyramid, which actually was for her father, Amenemhet III. But both of these pyramids at Mesguna were destroyed in antiquity for some reason. Now, the one for her brother does seem to have had a burial in it, and it may or may not have been him, not sure, because there's evidence that it was robbed, you know, at an early date. But nobody was ever buried in the one that was prepared for her, which was Mesguna North. And so it's quite clear that she never made it to her pyramid. So she was clearly buried in secret by her supporters at the point of her death. And we don't know where she was buried. And to be honest, the Egyptians themselves didn't know where she was buried, even by the early stages of the 18th dynasty, that, you know, during the New Kingdom, because people were looking for her tomb and going to random tombs from her period and saying, well, maybe it was this one, and leaving messages there. So, you know, it's clear that even by within, say, 300 to 400 years of her death, nobody knew where she was buried. And this makes her story such an enigma. And I think that this is why, and obviously we'll come on to this, why her story has almost come to its fore through the back door of history in a way, because unlike the other female pharaohs such as Hatshepsut, you know, Nefertiti, Cleopatra, who we know an awful lot about, with Sobekneferu, it's only been almost like fringe elements of the Egyptological community, historians who have really taken an interest in her. I mean, for instance, this happened in the 19th century, in 150 years ago, where a particular Egyptologist named Heinrich Bruges started to write about her, realized that the kings of the 13th dynasty were all named Sobek. So clearly they were following in her footsteps and honored her. And he said that clearly she'd revived some kind of cult, that she was very, very important for a whole dynasty to basically deify her after her death. These stories were picked up on by a more speculative historian by the name of Gerald Massey, who wrote a series of books on ancient history and ancient mythologies and whatever, where he realized that her main god was Sobek, the crocodile god, an extremely ancient, god, whose mother, by the way, is the hippopotamus goddess Neith, a very, very ancient goddess of ancient Egypt, who would seem to have been also very important to Sobekneferu. And basically, he said she revived this very, very ancient cult that clearly continued on long after her death and probably continued on even beyond dynastic history. And what's so interesting about this is that the Irish writer Bram Stoker would seem to have picked up on these stories and decided to feature Sobekneferu Ray as the antagonist in his Egyptian novel called The Jewel of Seven Stars, which was published in 1903. And this is a story where basically these British Egyptologists go to Egypt, they find this tomb, they bring back the coffin to the UK, and they do this ritual, and this Egyptian royal female appears, and she wreaks havoc and eventually disappears. And I mean, this story was considered to be so shocking to the post-Victorian audience, which it was aimed at, because it was 1903, just after the Victorian age, that the publishers said to Bram Stoker, "You've got to change this for future editions." But the thing is that we know Sobekneferu, but through different names, because so many horror films that have been made since that time that feature a royal female, Egyptian female, coming back from the dead are all based on Bram Stoker's book, right the way through to 2017's The Mummy, yes. Featuring Tom Cruise, starring Tom Cruise, I should say. I mean, that is, that was based on Bram Stoker's book. And what's quite clear is that the makers of these films have done their homework and realized that it can only be based on Sobekneferu because of the time frame involved, and so they give little nods to her as as the film proceeds with its storyline. The script writers. So this, in other words, we know of Sobekneferu Re. I say Re. That's often that the Re is put at the end of her name, and so in other words, we do know of her, but not by her name. And the other interesting thing is that in the occult world, she is incredibly important. There was a writer and researcher by the name of Kenneth Grant that wrote 3 trilogies of books on the origins of magic, going back to ancient Egypt and beyond to Africa and voodoo and whatever. And he basically looked at Sobekneferu, having read the works of Gerald Massey and Heinrich Bruges, and basically realized that she was an incredibly important person to the foundations of the magical tradition, the Western magical tradition, and that she should be honored in this manner. So she features in his book, and he also says, she's quite clearly Bram Stoker's Queen Tira, who is the name of the antagonist in The Jewel of Seven Stars.
All right, Andrew, we'll take a quick time out and come back and continue to delve into the life of the first female pharaoh, the Crocodile Queen. Andrew Collins stays with us. What would it feel like to reclaim your health, your vitality, to sleep deeply, to live fully, to address health at the root, at the cellular level, so that your body can detect damage where you have it? Imagine living younger, longer, having the energy to do what you want to do when you want to do it. Discomfort fading away. ASEA Redox Supplement harnesses the power of your body to heal itself, giving you the ability to power your potential. This is one of the most profound health, athletic, and anti-aging discoveries of our lifetime, and we need the world to know about it. If you want to learn more about ASEA, visit strangeplanet.teamasea.com. strangeplanet.teamasea.com, and be sure to text or call my colleague and friend Lynn at 443-254-6024, 443-254-6024 to order or for additional information. ASEA Redox Supplement. It's truly wellness redefined. Andrew Collins is with us, and the book is The First Female Pharaoh. There it is, right there. The Turin Canon. Sobekneferu is mentioned in the Turin Canons. What are they, or what is it?
Well, the Turin Canon is a list of kings that was written on papyrus. I think during the reign, if I remember rightly, of Ramesses III. I think he's in the 19th dynasty, and it was found in Egypt and brought back to Italy. But unfortunately, by the time it reached its destination and they unpacked it, it was in pieces. I mean, lots of pieces. And from that time onwards, which was the end of the 19th century through to the present day, Egyptologists have been trying to piece it together, and there's still debate about which bits go where and whether this refers to that king or this king or whatever. And the reason why it's important to this story is because some people will hold up their hand and say, well, hold on, you're saying that this woman was in the 12th dynasty. She ruled around 1800 BC. There was another female king called Nitocris who ruled in the 6th dynasty. So that would take us back to about 2100, 2200 BC. I mean, surely she's the first female pharaoh. The problem with this, and this is where the Turin Canon comes in, is that recent reassessments of the evidence that people use for the existence of this particular female king pharaoh have now fallen apart. An Egyptologist by the name of Kim Reicholt published a really important paper in the year 2000, which you can read about in the wiki page for Nitocris, that basically says that the person that they thought was a female pharaoh is in fact a man, and one that we already know about, and one that's already recorded his deeds and whatever, and that she can't possibly be that. Well, Nitocris herself is talked about in the works not of ancient Egypt, but in the Greek tradition, and in particular within the writings of Herodotus. Now, Herodotus is considered to be the father of history, writing about 450 BC. And he talks about Nitocris, and what the story that he gives is that her brother, the king, that's the term, her brother, the king, was murdered, and that she took revenge on those who were conspired to commit this murder, and the story is that she got them all in for a big banquet and then allowed the waters of the Nile to come in through a channel and drown them all. But it then says that after this, she then, so that she herself didn't suffer the same sort of retribution, she went into this room full of hot ashes and killed herself. In other words, committed suicide. Now, this is a very bizarre story which needs a lot of unpicking. I mean, firstly, I propose in the book that it was, the people supporting her that killed her brother. And if that's the case, why would she be killing them? Why would she be, holding them, to account for actually, doing this crime? Well, the answer is she didn't. I mean, what was quite clear is that her brother was killed and she blamed whoever she wanted. And this was a way of just getting rid of anybody who supported her brother, so that they wouldn't cause problems during her reign. So they almost certainly were put to death. I don't think for a second that they were drowned by waters coming in for the Nile. This seems to be a story that's related to the Egyptian labyrinth and the fact that it was at the end of a canal that came in from the Nile, which had been cleared in a huge engineering project during the time of her father, Amenhotep III, and probably completed during the reign of her brother and hers as well. So in other words, there's a confusion come in as to how these people died. But then you have this story about her going into this room with hot ashes so that she herself doesn't suffer the same type of retribution. What's all that about? Well, I think that this is a very distorted memory of her committing suicide via some kind of ritual death involving hallucinogens that would have been burned through hot ashes, in other words, burning of incense. Plus, I suspect that there would have been the ingestion of, psychoactive substances as well. And that, this allowed her transition, if you like, from this world into the afterlife. In other words, people were coming for her. She was probably going to be murdered anyway or paraded around or whatever. And she thought the best thing to do to save the country and allow the next dynasty to take over was to take myself out of the picture. So she committed ritual death. And what's interesting here, of course, is that this is exactly what happens to Cleopatra the Seventh. She also commits a ritual death, what we'd call suicide. And the story about her, of Cleopatra, having this snake that's brought in a basket of fruit, and it's then allowed to bite her, and it's poisonous and it kills her. That's simply a symbolic story relating to how she died, because a snake is a symbol of the goddess Isis, to which Cleopatra was devoted to, and Isis was the goddess of medicine and magic. In other words, she was the one that had all the knowledge of, plant medicines and drugs and stuff like this. In other words, it's a metaphor really for the use of drugs to die. And, scholarly work has been done on what might have happened to Cleopatra, and they have now concluded that almost certainly she would have taken a cocktail of drugs that would have been psychoactive in nature.
So Sobekneferu, she reigned for 4 years. Do we know how old she was at the time of her death?
Well, I mean, as I said, she had two siblings. What would appear to be an older sister, who clearly was going to rule ahead of her, who was Nefertar. She dies between the age of probably about 16 to 18. And once she's, out the way, her brother, who seems to be a half brother, who is Amenemhet IV, becomes the king. He becomes Pharaoh of Egypt, and he rules for about 9 years, basically. Now, I think that Sobekneferu took on the role that her sister was going to play. Now, whether she did this officially or unofficially, we don't know. There's nothing in the records, nothing that's been found so far to suggest it. But the implications are, particularly from, let's say, the Nitocris story, because I show that there's absolute evidence that Sobekneferu is Nitocris. She's the real Nitocris, and that the story of Nitocris in Herodotus relates to the Middle Kingdom, it relates to the 12th dynasty, and not anything to do with the 6th dynasty. This is a complete misnomer. And one that's borne out by, as I said, that the work that's been done by Kim Ryholt, the Egyptologist. But basically, she then, I think, starts to rule with her brother. Now, at this point, she can only be quite young. I mean, she's certainly no older than her sister, so she could be 16 to 18, let's say. So if you put another decade on that, she's going to be in her late 20s. So I think probably by the time that she dies, she's in her early 30s. But no more than that.
She died childless, though, correct? Like, why
Well, again,
was she not interested?
This is an interesting story, because the first two kings of the 13th dynasty, who unquestionably supported her, Kim Ryholt has suggested, were the sons of Amenemhet IV. In other words, her brother. And if she killed her brother, then why would it be that these two young children would end up supporting her, unless A, they didn't know that her that their surrogate mother was involved with his death, or they accepted that it was the right thing to do. In other words, they were maybe indoctrinated into her ideas and why the death of their father had to happen. But whatever the answer, they become the first two kings, and both of them have names which have within them the god Amun. And of course, the brother and father of Sobekneferu Ray also had names involving the god Amun, who was the patron god of Thebes. Their name was Amen Emhat. And various of the other kings of the 12th dynasty also had a name meaning Amen Emhat. Sorry, who had the same name. So, in other words, the cult of Amun was obviously considered to be very special and important to this particular dynasty. But as I said, Sobekneferu herself seems to have brought to the fore the god Sobek and, made him virtually the state god and created a monotheistic religion very similar to how Akhenaten, with his wife Nefertiti, tried to create their own monotheistic religion several hundred years later. And of course, that failed. And the son of Akhenaten and Nefertiti would seem to have been Tutankhamun, who obviously we know about, and we know a lot about that particular period because of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb.
All right, another time out. We'll be back in a moment. What would it feel like to reclaim your health, your vitality, to sleep deeply, to live fully, to address health at the root, at the cellular level, so that your body can detect damage where you have it? Imagine living younger, longer, having the energy to do what you want to do when you want to do it. Discomfort fading away. ASEA Redox Supplement harnesses the power of your body to heal itself, giving you the ability to power your potential. This is one of the most profound health, athletic, and anti-aging discoveries of our lifetime, and we need the world to know about it. If you want to learn more about ASEA, visit strangeplanet.teamasea.com, strangeplanet.teamasea.com, and be sure to text or call my colleague and friend Lynn at 443-254-6024, 443-254-6024 to order or for additional information. ASEA Redox Supplement. It's truly wellness redefined. And we are here with Andrew Collins, science and history writer investigating advanced civilizations, and the latest book is The First Female Pharaoh, Sobekneferu, Goddess of the Seven Stars. Where is that available, Andrew? How do we get a copy?
You can get it at any online bookstore, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Simon & Schuster, published by Inner Traditions International. And if people are interested in this, then there's more material on Sobekneferu on my website, andrewcollins.com, which also have all my social media links.
Can you briefly give us kind of an overview of Sobekneferu's role in the biblical story of Joseph?
Yeah, this is very interesting. I mean, obviously, the Bible most people will see as a fiction, if you like, or at least parables or made up of composite characters or whatever. But I mean, there's no question that a lot of the people of the Book of Genesis almost certainly are based on real individuals that existed, and one of them, of course, is Joseph. Now we know him of the technicolored coat and the story of his brothers abandoning him, leaving him to die. He's sold into slavery into Egypt, where he becomes a servant of a household, and the wife of the man of the house accuses him of coming on to her. It's false, but he gets thrown into prison. But he has this reputation for being able to interpret people's dreams. And the king, the Pharaoh, has these dreams about these 7 fat cows and 7, not very fat cows. And, he's asked to interpret this. And he basically says, look, there's a famine on the way. You've got to stock up with your grain now, because there'll be 7 years of famine. And of course, that's exactly what happens. And because of this, Joseph rises to become the most important person in Egypt, other than the king himself, the vizier. And this is the story that the Bible gives us. And there is absolute evidence to suggest that Joseph was a real person and did live in Egypt during the reign of Sobekneferu's father, Amenemhet III. And according to Arab sources, which were based on much earlier Coptic traditions, which were Christian but probably came from earlier Semitic, in other words, Hebrew stroke Israelite sources in Egypt, pad out this story more, and they say that Joseph was involved with engineering projects in the Fayum to not only cut a canal between the Nile and the Fayum Lake, which in ancient times was known as Lake Morris, but also that he built a palace for Pharaoh's daughter. Now, everything that's talked about Pharaoh's daughter has led me to conclude that this is unquestionably Sobekneferu. The fact that he's there, he exists at the time of her reign. And my colleague David Roll, an Egyptologist, himself wrote an entire book talking about Joseph and showing that he was a real person during the time of Amenemhet the third, her father, and that he continued to exist, as continued to live through the reigns of Amenemhet IV, Sobekneferu, and possibly even into the reigns of the first couple of kings of the 13th dynasty. So he was around. And so we have to look at the possibility that Sobekneferu knew Joseph. And what the Bible tells us is that Joseph was aligned to the temple of the sun god Ra at Heliopolis. And we know this because his master, when he was a servant, would seem to have been, the high priest of Heliopolis, which was known in the Bible as On, just O-N. So, in other words, if Joseph has become vizier, then he's quite clearly linked to the temple of Ra at Heliopolis, which is somewhere that's very close to Cairo. Now, the importance of this is that Sobekneferu's brother, Amenemhet IV, aligned himself not with Sobek, not with the Fayum, but with the Semitic peoples, the temple of Heliopolis and Ra. In fact, he made the form of Ra, the creator god form of Ra, which was Atum, his own personal god. And it would seem that he was preparing to create his own kingdom outside of Egypt in what is today the Sinai, based around this cult center called Salabat el Qadam, which was dedicated to a goddess called Hathor, who I think was very important to Sobekneferu Ray, by the way. And that the significance here is that the Heliopolitan priesthood unquestionably were very sympathetic to the incoming Semitic peoples. In other words, they embraced them in a progressive way. So that if they had this power when Sobekneferu's brother was ruling the country, and suddenly this was taken away from them when she came to the throne, because she obviously installed the god Sobek and his priesthood as the main men of the country, then quite clearly they'd have been, they wouldn't have been happy about this. And I think that there's good evidence that to suggest that the people that were gunning for her was the Heliopolitan priesthood. They were the ones that wanted to get rid of her. And one of the reasons why I think that they got some support was because we know that in the third year of Sobekneferu's reign, there were incredibly low floods in Egypt. Now, what this means is that the inundation, the yearly inundation that would take place of the waters coming down from Ethiopia, flooding down through Sudan into Egypt, these melt waters plus also monsoon waters that would flow in. Some years they would fail, and the third year of her reign, we don't know about the first, the second, the fourth, but in the third year they were very low. Now this causes great problems because it means that the waters don't overflow the low-lying lands in the Nile Valley that bring the rich nutrients in the mud that settles, that allows the seeds to grow with the crop the following year. In other words, it will cause a famine. And in ancient Egypt, this was blamed on the pharaoh, and if they didn't sort it out, then quite clearly the tides would turn against them. And it's even been suggested by some Egyptologists that during this period, a pharaoh would commit suicide if the floods failed. In other words, they realized that they were going wrong and somebody else had to rule the country, and that they would take themselves out of the picture. So I think that this is one of the pieces of evidence that tells us why Sobekneferu would have herself committed suicide.
Now, in large measure, thanks to your help, and Sobekneferu has returned to sort of popular consciousness. Has this created greater interest among Egyptologists, traditional Egyptologists, alternative Egyptologists, to explore her life further? For example, do you think there'll be maybe now a concerted effort to try and locate where she's buried?
That's a very nice thought. But the facts are the facts, and my background is journalistic. I am not an academic. I'm not a scholar, and because of that, my work, the work that we're promoting here now, is essentially going to be ignored by Egyptology. I mean, some of them will be curious and they'll want to read it, of course, or flick through it, particularly if they've got an interest in this period of Egyptian history. But I know from the fact that the publishers have tried to interest certain Egyptologists in perhaps giving it a quote or a review or whatever, that they want to avoid it like a barge pole, basically. As far as they're concerned, this has come from outside of their own close community, so it's meaningless.
Do you have any thoughts on where Sobekneferu may have been laid to rest?
Yes, I do. I mean, people have suggested she could be in one or other of the pyramids that we don't know who that they were created for. Could be one of hers. Now, this could have been reappropriated, they could have been left empty or whatever, but the suggestion is she could have been buried at Saqqara, which is very close to the old ancient capital of Memphis. She could have been buried in Dashur. There's a couple of pyramids there that people are not sure who was buried in them. But I think that she was probably buried close to where she ruled from. And when I say ruled from, I mean from a personal level. I mean, the main capital at this time was on the Nile, but this was like the official place, where kings ruled from. She herself would seem to be much more strongly associated with the Fayum, which was to the west of the main place of rule, and was connected with the palace there, connected with the temple of Sobek, connected with the lake, connected with this strange temple on the north side of the Fayum called Khazar Saga, which seems to be aligned to stars associated with Sobek. And I think that she's somewhere in that area, in the northern Fayum. I think that she was either buried in a tomb that was probably dug for somebody else and probably was waiting for its burial. And she's either there, or unfortunately, at some later point, that tomb was robbed, and any real memory or evidence that she was placed in it, I think, has probably been lost. I hope that's wrong, of course. And we're going to Egypt in November. If people are interested in that, we're doing a tour. Myself, Hugh Newman, and Megalithomania. All details on andrewcollins.com or Megalithomania website. And we're going to be looking at this very question on the tour. Where is Sobekneferu buried? Can we find more clues? Is there anything that I've missed, for instance? So this is a quest in its own right. Where is she now? And all we can say is that she's certainly coming back into popular consciousness. And by virtue of that, she's achieving the immortality that perhaps she was denied at the end of her own life. I mean, if we look at, let's say, Tutankhamun, before Tutankhamun was found, his tomb in 1922, we knew essentially nothing about Tutankhamun. But after the tomb was discovered, he becomes arguably the most famous pharaoh of the whole of ancient Egypt. And does that in itself create immortality? You know, in other words, has he achieved what he wanted to do? His tomb being found intact, everybody knows about him, he'll never ever be forgotten about. Is that what immortality is? And if that is the case, then with Sobekneferu, she's been denied this for 3,800 years, but now for the first time she's coming back into popular consciousness. She's, you know, quite literally, you know, rising from the dead, and maybe one day she will achieve that immortality that the ancient Egyptian pharaohs so desired.
Andrew Collins, the author of the first female pharaoh, Sobekneferu, goddess of the seven stars. Andrew, thank you so much. Great to see you again.
Thank you very much for having me.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.